Russia's Vladimir Putin has finalized the annexation of 4 partially occupied Ukrainian regions, including Zaporizhia, home to Europe's largest nuclear power plant, even as his soldiers continue to retreat in the face of Ukraine's counter-offensive. So now, what are the chances of a nuclear attack by Russia against Ukraine? What look to be the consequences of such a confrontation? And how do these latest events look to affect Ukraine's application for NATO membership? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Vladimir Putin's attempts to invade Ukraine are being met with fierce resistance from soldiers there, who have been staging a commendable counteroffensive in recent days, raising concerns about the possibility of reckless retaliation from Russia. For more, I have Professor Lim Eun-jung at Kongju National University joining us live on the line. Professor Im, welcome.
Hello.
I also have Professor Robert English at the University of Southern California live on the line as well. Professor English, it's a pleasure.
My pleasure too.
Right, Professor Im, let's begin then with a few words on this potential reckless retaliation from Russia. What are the chances, Professor, of a nuclear confrontation in Ukraine led by Russia?
Well, it looks like there are different views on the, interpreting the real intention of President Putin or Russia in general. One group of experts will say, this is real threat because, before the war actually erupted, not that many experts expected that, again, Russia will really invade the Ukraine, but actually Putin decided to do so. So having had that kind of, situations, probably those experts will say this time too, we need to be really careful about, their real intention. On the other hand, some other experts will say, this might be just, bluffing, or it does have, of course, strategic calculation. Or even some of them will say this is a kind of reminiscent of madman theory. They do have, again, the strategic purposes to upgrade, to increase their power, negotiating powers, which, of course, is threatening to the not only just European countries and some other liberal countries too. So again, that there are two different views, mainly about the real intention. But I will say, as long as there is any possibility, of using even low-level nuclear weapon, again, the rest of the world, especially liberal countries, I think we really need to think about this kind of scenario in a very serious way, and we need to truly, I think, work on how to prevent, how to deter, that kind of action by the President Putin.
Right, and staying with that, Professor English, perhaps that is why White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan earlier warned Russia of catastrophic consequences should it take the nuclear road. How do you interpret these words?
They're an attempt to dissuade President Putin from using nuclear weapons and to remind him that we have choices. That if he were to use nuclear weapons, we would not immediately capitulate, back off, tell Ukraine to hold on and sue for peace. We could strike with advanced conventional weapons. We could conduct a shock and awe kind of campaign and destroy most of Putin's army in Ukraine in a matter of hours. We could strike and sink his Black Sea fleet, that entire naval flotilla, in less than 1 hour. And of course, we could strike Russian vessels, Russian forces where they're deployed elsewhere in the world without ever hitting Russia. So we're telling Putin that we have options too, and we won't be faced with an all or nothing choice should you go nuclear first. Be very careful.
Right, and while the US and Russia are engaged in a war of words, Professor Im, Ukraine, for its part, appears to be accelerating its application for NATO membership after Putin annexed 4 Ukrainian regions. How does this particular development look to affect Ukraine's fight against Russian invasion, do you think?
Well, I think from national security of Ukraine is that from that perspective, I think that this is a kind of natural, how do you say, reaction to the Russia's that annexation of the full regions of Ukraine. As we know, the Baltic three countries and some other Eastern European countries, they already declared that that they're going to support the membership of NATO. Ukraine's that membership to the NATO. But the thing is, when any country, of course, NATO is much more open to any possible, those partner country. But the thing is, if a country wants to get a membership and the NATO, they need to get a unanimous, the consensus agreement from the all member states. Probably Turkey-like countries or Hungary-like countries, they will be very much, cautious or even reluctant to accept that kind of application, or even Washington too, because NATO, it does have the nuclear sharing for the collective security. So as long as all this nuclear escalation can be a possibility, probably Washington will be pretty much cautious about the final decision too.
Right. And Professor English, China, for its part, has warned of grave consequences should Ukraine join NATO. Again, what is your interpretation of these words?
It's a reminder in the first place that China's view is that the United States and its NATO allies are largely responsible for this conflict because of the push to bring Ukraine into NATO that's been underway for more than a decade. It hadn't advanced terribly far, but officially Ukraine was a candidate country. The United States President, George W. Bush, and then his successor, Obama, both said it's a matter of time. It's not whether, but when, right? So in China's view, this was part of the provocation of Russia. Therefore, when China says today, don't even think of expanding NATO, they're basically supporting the Russian position and saying that it's Western aggression, Western encirclement, Western military power that frightened Putin into launching this war. And in some sense, it could be that China is signaling a similar interpretation of its confrontation with America in the South China Sea. Right? They see the constant American naval presence off their shores, the dominance of the American Navy in Pacific waters, like NATO breathing down Russia's neck. And they're signaling that they think that's wrong too. So they support Russia because it's a sort of a parallel geostrategic situation.
Right. Meanwhile, on the actual battlefield, Professor Im, Ukraine has been making remarkable advances. How do you explain Ukraine's feats on the battlefield?
Well, how would you say, first of all, I would say President Zelensky is that amazing leadership. I think it was really one of the key variables. As we all know, even though Ukraine is also a pretty large country in the European continent, but as we all know, Russia is much bigger and its military capability was supposed to be stronger than the Ukraine. But under the President Zelensky is that kind of amazing leadership. They really showed, the Ukrainian people, they really showed their strong solidarity and very strong will to protect themselves and to protect their own territory. So those kind of, how to say, solidarity was pretty much just not only just, impressive, it was really impactful to many other countries' perception or interpretation of the war too. So that is why I think one big reason why Ukraine was able to get the strong support from other countries, of course, including, the United States or other Western European countries. Not only those, so-called Western countries, some other liberal countries, including, of course, South Korea-like country, Japan-like country, we all were pretty much, again, I think, impressed by that solidarity, very strong will to fight against the invasion. Mm-hmm.
Right. Professor English, as Professor Im mentioned earlier, in the early days of Russia's invasion, there was much concern, fear actually, that Ukraine would be conquered very quickly. But in recent days, it has been seen that Russia is suffering humiliating losses. How do you explain this?
I explain it in exactly the way that Professor Lim has explained Ukraine's successes, right? Russia has weaker morale. Russia has poorer weapons. Russia has inferior command and organization. And Russia has inferior intelligence and surveillance capabilities. In many of these, it's because the West is helping Ukraine and has augmented in all these areas. Of course, the morale is Ukrainians alone. In other words, everything that Ukraine is doing better and has better, Russia is now shown to be weaker. All Russia had at the outset was greater numbers, massive numbers. But in every other respect, their quality was lower. And now that those numbers are running out, the advantage in quality is telling in a big way on the battlefield. And that's why Ukraine has turned the tide of battle and is now advancing.
Right. And that being said then, Professor Im, what are your prospects with regard to Russia's attempts to invade Ukraine? I mean, how do you see this particular war playing out?
Well, I think now it's pretty much dependent on Russian people. Well, of course, President Putin is authoritarian leader, and his so-called, dictator-like leadership has lasted for many decades, which resulted in a kind of situations like this. If with South Korea, we experienced a similar dictatorship too a long time ago. But when the dictator really decides on something, his or her information can be pretty much limited because he is now surrounded by just, his yes men. So with only those, yes men who probably misjudges or who miscalculate the situation, among those kind of people, probably the final decision maker cannot make a really rational choice. That's really the kind of inherent weakness of, I think, a dictatorship. But anyhow, President Putin, it looks like so far he is controlling over his elites, or like even the party, the censor those government people. But the thing is, how people think about all this, his decision. A few days ago, you might have heard as news, but his name was pretty much unfamiliar to me. But Russian rapper Patuni, the 27-year-old guy, rapper, he committed a suicide, and he claimed that he's against this war and that he didn't want to be a killer in the battlefield, which is against his own will. So he, killed himself, which is a tragedy. And this kind of, Russian young people's very, very sad or very negative feelings about, the Kremlin's decision. I think this can be a backlash, against the current government or current leadership.
Right, and staying with the negative sentiment, Professor English, do you see the lackluster support, if I may, from China and perhaps India as affecting Putin's future actions against Ukraine?
I don't think so in the short run. When you say lackluster support from India, from China, you're probably referring to criticism, caution, desire that the war end, and of course they would be shocked at any use of nuclear weapons. But India is still buying Russia's oil, China oil and gas and other commodities. I don't see that flagging, at least not in the next few months. And that's when things will be decisive. If the Russians can slow the Ukrainian advances, hang on, they'll slowly be pushed back, but they still control a huge swath of the country. The winter is coming, the battlefield will slow down. Putin might be able to regroup. He certainly is keeping ironclad control at home. So criticism from India or China isn't going to be critical in the short run. They're not going to withdraw economic support because it's in their interest to keep trading as well. I think Putin's going to act as Putin has always acted, keeping his own counsel, and none of us really know when he will feel so cornered that he'll do something desperate. Would he actually use nuclear weapons or not? We are all guessing, unfortunately. And that's why the U.S. is trying to advance slowly. You'll notice that the White House has turned down the Ukrainians' desperate requests for an advanced tactical missile system, one that can strike with high accuracy, 200 miles. That would be a real escalation. The Americans are being very careful about that because they don't want to see Putin suddenly lash out, and they're slowly increasing the pressure in a measured way.
Right, of course not. All right, Professor, thank you very much for your thoughts, Professor English, and Professor Im, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.